Page 73, lesson 12. Now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." We come to know to Luke's account of the trial and crucifixion of Jesus for full and complete detail of these events. We would need to read from all four of the Gospels for this lesson. However, we will be looking only at Luke's account. Portions of the reading for this lesson are found only in the Gospel of Luke. Rather than isolating these sections, we will briefly examine the entire passage, keeping the details unique to Luke in the context of the main storyline shared by all four Gospels. No, we got this one and one more. I thought we was on 13 last week, but we was on 11. So I'm going back on for no reason. Somebody want to do a couple paragraphs?
There were two parts of Jesus' trial. The first was Jewish and the second was Roman. On the right, that Jesus was arrested. He was first taken to the house of Ananias, the former high priest, and then to Caiaphas, and the present high priest for questioning. The following morning, Jesus was taken before the assembly Jewish leaders or Sanhedrin. This is where Luke picks up the narrative. Luke's account of the trial is a brief summary of the two parts, but there is enough information for us to understand the main points. The hearing before the religious leaders was to find Jesus guilty of some offense. Luke 22:66 through 71. They asked Jesus directly if he was the Christ or Messiah, and he affirmed that this was true. This is what they had been waiting for. They had tried numerous times to find something in Jesus' words to trap him. He was in Matthew and Mark that they charged Jesus with blasphemy and offense punishable by death. They were unable to carry out this offense, however, because of the Romans, and so they took him to Pilate, the Roman governor, in particular. Luke 23:1 through 25.
Somebody else want to do a couple?
When the leaders brought Jesus to Pilate, they said nothing about blasphemy, which was a religious offense. Instead, they said that Jesus was supposed to oppose to the Roman government and claim to be a king. Pilate was likely prepared for a criminal like Barabbas, but that wasn't what met his eyes. He saw nothing in Jesus to suggest a rebel leader or insurrectionist. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked Jesus. Pilate would have had little concern for titles like Christ or Messiah that were essentially religious, but king did imply a threat to Roman rule. Even though Jesus answered his question in the affirmative, Pilate saw nothing in Jesus to find him guilty and tried to have him released. The leaders would have nothing of this and tried to persuade Pilate that Jesus had been a troublemaker from Judea all the way into Galilee. When Pilate heard this, he decided to send Jesus to Herod. Only Luke tells us about Jesus' hearing before Herod, Luke 23:6 through 12. This was Herod Antipas, a son of Herod the Great, and ruler over Galilee and Perea. He was the one who had John the Baptist executed. Herod must have thought of Jesus more like a magician and had hoped to see a miracle, but Jesus refused to speak to him or perform for him. The rulers made accusations against Jesus, but Herod evidently ignored them and sent him back to Pilate.
Anthony, you'll do the last two.
When they brought Jesus back to Pilate, he told the rulers that neither he nor Herod found any reason to find Jesus guilty. This was the second time that Pilate tried to have Jesus released. To appease them, Pilate offered to have Jesus beaten before he was released. By this time, a mob had gathered that loudly demanded that Pilate release Barabbas instead. The other Gospels mention that there was a tradition that the governor release a prisoner during the Passover, and this is what the crowd demanded. Pilate again, for a third time, tried to have Jesus released, but the mob was now shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate tried to reason with them, explaining that he found no reason for the death penalty and offered to have Jesus beaten and released, but the mob wouldn't hear of it. In the end, Pilate gave in to the demands of the mob, not because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the easiest thing to do. He released Barabbas, a notorious criminal, and sent Jesus to be crucified.
All right. Would they have crucified Christ if it wasn't in the time for him to be crucified? Because it was all God's plan, and
It was gonna happen.
yeah,
No matter what, it was gonna happen. And Jesus even said during that time, he said, "You don't take my life, I give my life." So, in other words, you have no control in me. That God has the control.
so they were just following plans.
They were just pawns in God's will. And they fell right into it because they were selfish and they wanted power, and they knew Jesus was a threat to their power, and so they fell right into it. And that was a big thing, but yeah, it was gonna happen regardless.
Well, I don't know, it seemed like that was, I know that that's what God planned. But you hate to see one man do away, have all of our sins taken away.
Yep. Yep, he was a human sacrifice. Yep. So, yeah,
When, he died on the cross, his body could feel all the sin going into him.
do you remember the part where Jesus said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?"
Yeah.
That's when God looked away because he couldn't see the sin. Because Jesus had absorbed all the sins, and God couldn't look on him anymore. So Jesus felt alone at that time on the cross.
Yeah.
It had been hard on him because God had been with him the whole time through the whole deal, and then all of a sudden God's not there.
Yeah.
He can't feel God with him.
Yeah, that would be something similar to us losing a loved one.
Just like God was losing his son. I mean, yeah, he really did. He lost his son that was alive on earth, but he gained him back through the Spirit.
Yeah.
One of the most amazing things about the gospel accounts of Jesus' death is their simplicity, brevity, and lack of embellishment. Jesus certainly suffered terribly on the cross. Crucifixion was one of the most cruel forms of execution ever devised, yet none of the writers of the gospel dwelt on the suffering of Jesus. Jesus' death was an important part of God's plan, and without it, there would be no competent and final forgiveness of sin. The crucifixion, however, is secondary to the resurrection. If Jesus had not conquered death and been raised from the dead, then we would have no hope. Once Jesus was finally sentenced to death, the Roman system of justice moved quickly, and he was paraded through the streets to the place of execution. Luke adds some details about women who mourned for him, verses 28 and 31. Little did they know that Jesus' comments were a prophecy of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. When they arrived at the skull, also known as Calvary and Golgotha, Jesus and two others were placed on the cross. Luke reported simply, they crucified him. Somebody will read a couple.
Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Is the verse of Jesus saying from the cross. Verse 34. Luke recorded two others, verse 43 and 46, and the rest of the founding in the other gospel. Only Luke recorded the story of the criminals that were crucified with Jesus. One of them insulted Jesus as him, a ruler and soldier. The other one shows signs of repentance and belief in Jesus. Jesus' statement, "Say you will be with me in paradise," suggested that the man would be given salvation based on his confidence. There has been much discussion on Jesus' word. We need to remember that Jesus had forgiven the sins of others before and could have done so for this man as well. The requirements of salvation changed after Jesus' resurrection and return to heaven, but that does not alter Jesus' word to this man or his spiritual condition. After Jesus had died, a good man named Joseph, a member of
Sanhedrin.
Sanhedrin.
requested Jesus' body so that he would be properly buried. The Roman typically refused burial of a crucified criminal after allowing the body to decay on the cross. It may have been Joseph's status in the community that propelled Pilate to release to him the body of Jesus. Joseph was securely a disciple of Jesus, John 19:38, who had not agreed with those who had condemned him. Verse 51. Joseph must have thought that this was the last thing that he could do for Jesus, and so he prepared Jesus' body as best he could and placed it in his own tomb. Some of the women followed Jesus' father Joseph to the tomb. It is likely that Then he also wanted to show a final kindness to Jesus, and so they made plans to return to the tomb after the Sabbath with more spices and perfume for Jesus' body.
Let's go through this one a little bit. It's a little entailed. Up here where the three are on the cross. And a lot of people have a lot of different questions about how that could happen. How could Jesus say what he said on the cross when I'm finding the book? Today you will be with me in paradise. They wonder how that could happen. Well, for one, because he wasn't baptized. One, they were under the old covenant, they weren't under the new covenant. The new covenant had not come into play yet. So Jesus could very well say what he said, because that requirement was not yet made, because he was still under the old covenant. So that is a true statement, and he was with him that day. Because after Jesus died, he took away all the sins. And if you remember shortly, after he died and was put in the grave and he arose, then all the people came out in the streets, all the dead people came out in the streets in Jerusalem. So he had taken care of all that was under the old Abrahamic covenant. He then to come forward to the new covenant. And so that's when all that happened. Because the new covenant was at hand. There's something else I was thinking here. Oh, on the Sabbath, that was, when Jesus died, he died right before the Sabbath. He died early enough that they could get his body to the grave before Sabbath started. Because Sabbath started sundown Friday, and it's over sundown Saturday. So they had to get him in the tomb before sundown. And that's the reason they didn't have time to do anything. It's because by the time Jesus died, I think he died at 3 something in the afternoon. And then they had to get him from Golgotha back to the tomb. And so by the time they got him back, there was not time for that. I think all they were able to do was wrap him and put him in the tomb. Somebody want to do cool down?
Jesus, who had shown kindness and compassion to so many, was dead and his lifeless body placed in a borrowed tomb. If the story had ended here, it would have been truly tragic. If he was remembered at all, Jesus would have been remembered as a teacher or perhaps a martyr, but not as the Son of God. The good news is that the story doesn't end here. Just as Jesus had told the disciples several times that he would die and rise again, the story continues 3 days later with an empty tomb and a risen Lord.
And that's what gives us salvation.
They placed him in the tomb before the Sabbath. We don't observe the Sabbath like they did back then.
Should we?
We're not to work on Sundays.
Right. A lot of people don't sell liquor on Sunday. But it was very important. That day was very important. I'll have to go through a sermon of how Saturday was changed to Sunday.
But we have funerals on Sunday. And they wasn't allowed to back then.
Sure wasn't. They weren't allowed to do anything on the Sabbath. And today, we don't honor the Sabbath like we did, like they did back then. That's hence why you get a lot of churches say that law was hung on the cross. And that's where they think they can change it. All right, what are the 4 accounts of Jesus' trial and crucifixion different?
Where do we,
Question 1.
question is that, the difference, the way they done it back then, or the way we did it today?
The way the stories are told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And I don't know what difference it is.
None of them was present. It was all hearsay. So Matthew heard one story, Mark heard one, Luke heard one, John. So they told the story they were told. But they
Luke
weren't
was there with him.
At that time, no, they all turned away. When they took Jesus in, all the apostles did. Because then the Roman soldiers started asking, are any of you with him? And they no. And that's when Peter denied him the second time. He said, no, don't even know him. So, yeah, no, they were. Luke was not there at all. Luke was just the doctor. Luke's whole book is the stories he had been told, like from Paul and the other apostles. So, yeah, no, Luke wasn't there.
So really, his mother was, the only one there, was she was there with him.
Now, she was at the cross. Yeah, and John was at the cross. Because he looked down at John and said, this is your mother. So, that's when all that took place at the cross. But at the hearing, at the court trials, nobody was there except the Pharisees, Jesus, and the Roman rulers. But whenever it was carried out, his mother, Mary Magdalene, there were several other followers that were there.
So, none of the apostles was there, but they
John-
just hear words from people, and that's what they heard.
But
Yeah.
John was at the cross when Jesus died. And his mother, Mary Magdalene, that was it. What were the Jewish charges against Jesus?
Blasphemy.
Which is death. Why did they change this when they went to Pilate?
Because it wouldn't have resulted in a death penalty
No,
for the Romans.
that's right. They had to change the charge for Pilate because Rome wouldn't honor a religious crime. It had to be a real crime, a threat to Rome before Rome would honor it. Suppose for a moment that you knew nothing else about Jesus except the things that he said on the cross. What would these tell you about Jesus? Now this is going on Luke's account. And that's if you knew nothing else about Jesus but just what Luke said.
He's forgiving.
Huh?
He's forgiving.
He was a king. He saved a man on the cross that was dying. And the second reason would be because he said, Lord, forgive those, because they know not what they do.
The other man that, when Jesus died, was his sin forgiven, or did they go to hell?
The third one on the cross.
Yeah.
Yes. Because he made fun of Jesus while he was there. He said, if you're really the king, take us off this cross. If you're the Messiah, take us off this cross. So he doubted him. But the other one didn't. He believed him. He knew who he was. That's why Jesus told him, you'll be with me in paradise.
Yeah.
Luke mentions women disciples 3 times in the reading, 27, 49, and 55. What were they doing? Somebody read that, because I really have not heard him mention that.
Yeah, I hadn't made it.
They followed Joseph to the tomb. They were going to bring spices and perfumes for Jesus' body after.
What they actually say is they were going to prepare Jesus' body, but that does not make them a disciple. Makes them follower. I kind of disagree with his wording on this, because they were not considered disciples, they were considered followers. And what they were doing was preparing, they were with Jesus to the tomb. And that would have been Mary Magdalene, his mother, and probably some sisters. What do we know about Joseph of Arimathea? That's a good question. Jesus had visited Joseph only times, and Joseph had heard Jesus speak in public. Joseph was part of the Sanhedrin. He was part of it.
He was a secret follower of Christ.
Yeah. He didn't let the Sanhedrin know that he went to hear Christ speak or anything. So he believed in Christ. What risk did he take in his actions?
Exposure.
Huh?
Exposing himself.
Yeah, he exposed himself to any criminal charges. Sanhedrin could have barred him or killed him or anything over that. Read Isaiah 53, 4 through 9. Somebody want to turn to that? Isaiah 53, 4 through 9. Bear in mind, this was written 700 years before the death of Christ. Isaiah 53, 4 through 9. Uh-huh.
I got it.
Surely he hath borne our grief and carried our sorrow, yet he esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgression, he was buried for our iniquity. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He had led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before it shares its song. So he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and I will declare his generation. For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of the people, my people, he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
Okay, how do y'all think that parallels with Luke's account? Or what similarities do you see? If you go through the Roman trial, Jesus never opened his mouth at the second trial. He would ask him questions, but Jesus refused to answer. So that was that's the part in Isaiah where he said he kept his mouth shut. He did keep his mouth shut.
On verse 9, and they made his grave with the wicked. Now his tomb was, he was the only one in the tomb.
Yeah, but his grave was in a graveyard that was not the Sanhedrin didn't make much money, so that tomb was not with the rich side of town, it was the poor side of town. And common people were buried there. So murderers, rapists.
So that just meant that he was buried in the grave.
Yeah, in that area. If you were buried where he was buried, it was just a common symbol. It wasn't nothing. It was, because back then, the rich people would have their own burial sites, and the poor people would have their own burial. Golgotha was a poor area. Anything else?
Well,
What's really good about Isaiah, when they did the Bible, and I'm talking the first Bible, the King James, when they were doing the King James, Isaiah almost went into the New Testament. They had a hard time leaving Isaiah in the back. But if it had not been from the time span, Isaiah would actually be a book in the New Testament. One more lesson and we start on the new book. Our new book is called, it's actually the book that follows what we've been doing. It's called called A Church That Shines. Guys, this is our new book. And it's on Acts. It'll be another book that Luke wrote. Luke wrote Acts too.
How many did he write?
Two.
Two?
Luke and Acts. While you hear Paul and the other ones talk in the book of Acts, Luke is actually the one that wrote the book